everyone, welcome to episode 7 of Digital Insights. In this video, I wanted to touch upon the Optus hack that is on everyone's mind. Everyone's speaking about it, everyone's worried about it. If you're not from Australia, Optus is the second largest telco here. They have about 11 million users as of 2019. So that number is probably a lot more than that, largest being Telstra. In fact, I'm actually an Optus customer myself. On 23rd of September, I received an email from Optus that actually spoke about the breach a bit more officially. They mentioned that no financial information or passwords have been accessed. The information which has been exposed is my name, date of birth, email, phone number, address associated with my account, and the numbers of the ID documents I provided. That could have been a driver's license or it could have been a passport. What makes this quite significant is for KYC purposes, users are generally required to submit 100 points of ID. And this data here actually constitutes at least 100 points of ID. So this data breach actually has the potential for massive amounts of identity fraud if it falls into the wrong people's hands. Now, what we know about this data breach is that there is a lone hacker that is involved. I actually came across an article by Jeremy Kirk, who covers Aussie and global IT security, is the editor of ISMG Corp. He's creator of the Ransomware Files podcast. So he's actually covered this breach quite well. So what we do know at the moment is that there is a $1 million extortion threat in this data breach. The Optus attacker is a lone attacker. An unauthenticated API endpoint has led to this breach. It is obviously the country's largest ever, and in fact, it has been referred by Optus to the Australian Federal Police. So early Saturday, which is the 24th of September, a person going by the nickname Optus Data, he published 2 samples of this data in a well-known data leak forum. And Jeremy actually has done some investigation and found that looks legitimate. In fact, he actually went to one of the residences that is mentioned in the data leak and spoke to a lady, and she confirmed that that data belonged to her. She was an Optus customer until around 2018, so not anymore. So this leaked data may date back to 2017. So as I mentioned before, an unauthenticated API has potentially led to this data breach. What does that mean, unauthenticated? Generally, there is some sort of authentication around an API. So to call it, you need to be calling it from a given IP address, or you need to provide an API key, or OAuth is involved. Some level of technical handshake is required before the API knows that you are authorized to access it. And this API actually was totally unauthenticated, which means when you call it, it gives you the data. Now, when you call this API for a given customer record number, a customer ID, it gives you back the data for that customer. The API endpoint was api.www.optus.com.au. It's an odd URL, but Optus Data says it worked to exfiltrate the data because otherwise a DNS error occurred. So when you call this API for a given customer ID, it returns you all the data for that particular customer. So what this hacker has done is they've just looped through different customer IDs and they appeared to be sequential, which means that you just had to hit the API with different customer IDs and it would either return result if the customer ID was valid, or it would not return anything. So every time you get a valid response to the API, you just save that data locally. So that obviously led to a suspiciously high volume of data coming in, which actually let Optus know that there is something wrong. So they appeared to have some level of monitoring that would tell them that there is some anomalous behavior when it comes to the traffic that's coming to that API endpoint. So that's a good thing. The fact that this unauthenticated API was out there in the open, obviously it's not a good thing. It could be the result of just negligence in terms of the API being out there. The endpoint might not be something that is easily guessable, but at the same time, that API or something similar to it could be used and available to someone who's inspecting the API requests that are going to Optus from their website. So it's not hard for a hacker to actually try different things until they get to an API endpoint that works. Now, this hack happened on the 14th of September. So, why did Optus take so long to notify its customers? Now, some users are upset that why it took Optus this long to let its customers know. And I can probably see why Optus took its time because when a security situation is unfolding, it takes a while to actually figure out what is going wrong. Now, it might be easy to just notify your customers that something has happened, but then if you do not have all the information available to you, you're probably going to trigger a lot of panic. So it makes sense to actually get a handle on what has happened and to make sure that the damage can be controlled in some way. So all the focus is on controlling the damage instead of actually letting the word out that something wrong has happened. So I can see why Optus would have done that. Now, the thing to note here is security is hard for big, small, medium sized organizations, especially larger organizations that have applications that are distributed. There are a number of endpoints that need to be accessed for things to work. There are a number of services that are involved for a platform to work as a whole. These services are not necessarily managed by the same team. So teams need to coordinate to make sure the service that they are working on is actually secure. Now, probably someone did drop the ball here in putting the right security access controls for that API, which has led to this data breach. But these things can happen. Now, does that actually make Optus not liable? No, they're definitely liable for what has happened, especially when so much customer PII, personally identifiable information, has been leaked. In fact, latest development is that there is a class action being put together by Slater and Gordon against Optus for what has happened. So, yeah, this situation is unfolding as we speak, and this will be discussed and be spoken about as a case study for a long time to come. So, what are the things you could do to prevent a data breach like this in your business? There's a number of things. The first thing you want to make sure is access control. Do people who have access, do only those people who need access to a given endpoint have access? Now, that could be physical access or it can be virtual access. Now, if you have an API, that API can be called from a number of sources. So are you tying that API access down by IP address? So only relevant IP addresses can call that API. Now, if that API needs to be called by the browser, do you have some level of authentication that is happening on behalf of the user? So first the user needs to authenticate, then the browser can actually piggyback on that authentication to access the API. And even then, you want to make sure that the API only returns data relevant to that particular user. The other thing you want to make sure is anything that is not production. So you have a staging environment set up with potential customer data available on it. You want to make sure that is not accessible outside of your office network. Another thing to keep in mind is API keys. Now, if you need API keys for accessing particular data from an API, are those keys actually restricted to only retrieve the data that you are interested in returning from that API? There was actually an incident I was involved in recently, so I'm kind of speaking from personal experience, where when you ask for an API key for certain things, you need to be absolute sure that the API key that you're given actually is restricted in some way to return just the data you wanted to return. So, for example, we had an AWS API key that we needed for uploading files to Amazon S3, but what we were given was an API key that had full administrator access. Now, I won't go into details of what happened with that, but it just goes to show that you have to double check with the people giving you that API key that the relevant access restrictions that should be on that API key have been put in place. The hacker called Optus Data actually gave Optus 7 days, and the clock is now ticking for panicked Optus customers as the alleged data hacker threatens to sell the info to the highest bidder within days. We'll add links to Jeremy Kirk's Twitter feed, where he's sharing a ton of valuable information for affected users and the public in general. The data for those 9.8 million Australians have been stolen. 2.8 million of those extensive personal data stolen, including driver's license, passport number. So these numbers are massive. Things like this can happen. Obviously, this incident will serve as a wake up call to organizations big and small that you cannot think about data security as an afterthought. There is every chance that there can be a data breach that will lead to that customer data being stolen. So assume that you are vulnerable, pay some attention to absolutely everything you can think of to keep customer data secure. Ideally, as soon as you don't need that data anymore, just delete it unless you're required to keep it for legal reasons, for compliance reasons. And even then, maybe archive it so that it's not accessible via APIs. Try and ensure that your data is encrypted even at rest. What that means is even if someone can actually access the database, they can't read personally identifiable information without some sort of decryption key. Create a risk register with everything that can go wrong. Write the probability of that happening. Write the mitigation steps that you need to take to reduce the risk. Write the impact if that risk were to fire, and then have a serious conversation about how prepared you are or unprepared you are with regards to those risks. So, yeah, there's a number of things that can be done. That's all from me for now. Thanks for listening.